Tan is chairman, Sustainability Singapore Institute of Architects. Szue Hann is an architect. He is an award-winning development professional, architect, and thought leader in sustainability. He is chairman of Sustainability Singapore Institute of Architects and board members of Singapore Green Building Council, and is currently working on sustainable development for a leading hospitality chain. Han graduated from Arch from National University of Singapore with a visiting fellowship to the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, in 2007, and a BA, First Class of Honor, in 2006. On graduation, he was awarded the Lee Kuan Yew Medal and the Board of Architect Prize. Han is also appointed World Cities Summit Young Leaders and BCA Build Environment Young Leader. Han was Singapore 2015 and 16 Young Green Architect of the Year. His portfolio includes the award-winning Park Royal on Pickering with WOHA and the BCA Skylab, a rotatable test bed for new technology, which won a Minister Award of Singapore National Day 2017. He has spoken in numerous conferences, including Switch, the Asia-Pacific Urban Forum, and COP25 in Madrid. Szue Hann, it's a very great honor to welcome you on stage for today.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much, Professor Xavier. It's good to be here. I'm so sorry I'm a bit late. Believe it or not, I got lost. Couldn't find the entrance to this. So, not the best way to talk about smart technologies, right? However, I came in here thinking, look, this is imagination for 2050, right? Which is how many years away? 29 years away from here, right? And I thought, should I start preparing a talk where you predict the future, predict urbanism in the future and what's going to happen? Or should I basically go, look, what's happening today that can basically show us some lessons about the future? If it's okay for you, I chose the second option because I think nobody could predict 2020. Certainly nobody could predict the events that happened also last week, right? So bear with me, and I hope through this next, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, right, we'll all here have some solution for the future. I do also realize I'm talking to a whole group of business students. I was not a business student, and business really makes the world go round, as we've seen in 2020, right? So how can architecture and how can design and how can urban design become part of that system, all right? And to those of you who've logged in online, greetings, right? Good morning. I hope you can hear me fairly clearly. I'm speaking to you through a face shield, which is the very first time. So, the past 2 years have been pretty interesting, I think, in the history of recent times, right? As far as sustainability and as far as architecture and design and as far as, I think, the planet goes, right? We started 2019 being a bit more aware of the waste problem, right? What plastics are doing to the ocean, what landfills are actually doing to our environment. And then we basically continued 2019, or ended 2019, I'd say, with massive forest fires, which is unfortunate. And then, of course, at the beginning of 2020, which is this time last year, this thing happened. This thing started. Before that, I had the opportunity to attend COP25, which is a UN climate change conference in Madrid, wherein, unfortunately, there wasn't a major step forward in terms of climate change discussions, also because of certain superpowers basically holding back, right, on adopting some of these policies. That has something to do with this, obviously, right, with hopefully a new presidency being inaugurated smoothly, such that, certain changes can actually happen, right, as far as climate change policy is concerned, right? So we're living in a world of turmoil. Every day you wake up, you don't know what's going to happen, right? And to be honest, I think there's a lot of anxiety and so on that's currently happening in the world. So with that anxiety, how can architecture and urbanism actually come in and influence and help to heal people? Because ultimately we all live, work, whatever in buildings, right? The United Nations has got these goals ever since, I think it was 2015, right? You would have seen this everywhere, right? And I would be lying if I could say, hey, as an architect, I'm able to fulfill all of these goals. I cannot, right? There are certain things that are way beyond the bounds of you and I in any given profession or any given vocation that you choose, right? For instance, I'm not about to solve, or I'm not about to be able to solve this SDG number 16 anytime soon, right? Or even gender equality, even though we're starting to get a far more balanced gender distribution in the profession. What we can do, however, is to figure out from a physical design point of view, from an architectural point of view, what can we do in order to be able to achieve some of the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, right? And these are the 7, what we call the environmental design goals that the Singapore Institute of Architects has actually fashioned. And that includes education and integration, climate action, which is very broad, obviously, natural capital, resource management, urban harmony, health and well-being, and adaptability and longevity. Number 6 and number 7 is crucial because this talk is about designing healthy buildings and also about designing buildings for the future. And if you've been in Singapore long enough, the topic of conversation on conservation, which is the preservation of buildings and its adaptive reuse, that tends to get a lot of mileage because in the past, Singapore has tried to wipe its slate clean and created a brand new city, right? So what's left that we can actually conserve? So I graduated in 2007, right? So in how many years has it been? 13 or 14 years since then, I've worked on numerous projects in architecture in Singapore and overseas as well. And many of these projects have developed lessons on how sustainable buildings can actually be, right? There are buildings that are purely designed for commercial profit. There are buildings that are designed for the preservation of culture. There are buildings that are designed for people, right? And if you take all these elements together, how can we then combine into a critical example of what a sustainable building could actually be, right? Especially in the time of the pandemic as we're going through, right? So I'll end off today's lecture with that, actually. So Singapore, you might know this by now, but when I was a kid, right, this was the original land area. So the land area has kept growing, and it will be reclaimed up to a point where all these dark pink areas will eventually be reclaimed or will eventually add up to the floor area, right? So that's an additional 40% of land area of what was original, right? And if we're going through, of course, we don't have much climatic change or much seasonal change, but as a tree changes its form over time, over different seasons, can a building similarly do the same, right? So the first example of a smart building that I've worked on is this thing called the BCA Skylab, right? So this is a project for the government. Basically, the Building and Construction Authority, they're involved in determining the codes for buildings. So we designed a building that's plug and play. You could change its facade, you could change its walls, you could change its air conditioning and lighting systems and so on. And it would be rotatable depending on where the orientation of the sun is. So you could change its orientation. And basically, you could also put in a lot of sensors to determine how the building actually performs. So as we speak, if, for instance, the temperature becomes a bit warmer, the building would intelligently adapt, right? If the carbon dioxide composition becomes more as a result of me talking too much, right, or everybody talking and breathing too much, then the air quality and the fresh air intake could also be able to refresh itself, right? So this is fundamental in determining thermal comfort, first of all, and determining how much fresh air can actually be exchanged, right? Which is crucial, of course, in the time of COVID-19. Likewise with lighting and so on. So this is a very small test laboratory where all this could happen. The studies would be observed by researchers and so on in the other room. And this, even though it's not the most beautiful project in the world, became, I think, the start of a smart building conversation in Singapore. And this was completed about 5 years ago. If you take it on from a scale of a building to then the scale of a city, right? The term smart city, again, was very hot about 2 or 3 years ago. People sort of forgot about it in the time of COVID-19. But all the more, we need, I suppose you could call it a more, I think, holistic way of looking at smart cities in the time of COVID-19. There's a lot of debate now about whether or not we're trackable as people as a result of contact tracing and so on, and what that could actually mean, right? But taking a step back, what then would be a smart city? If you basically Googled smart city, and if you did an image search, this is what you would find, right? So it is about efficiency. It is about policing in some ways, right? Because all that data would then become, in some ways, it could be public domain or it could be government controlled and so on as well, right? There's a lot of debate about that. But there's little talk about how a smart city can actually be used to improve health, right? A lot of it, again, is about governance and about efficiencies, right? And if you don't believe me, try to commit, I don't know, a traffic fine or something. Here in Singapore, it's very easy for them to fine you, right? To find you, and it's very easy as well for you to be able to pay that fine as a result of all these interlinked systems. There are, of course, good things that come out of it, right? First of all, is the connectivity, is the efficiency. You basically get from point A to point B without much fuss here in Singapore. There's also aspects where there's underground cities and so on that's been laid out. As a result, it allows you to connect at a cooler temperature, right? And at a sheltered, in a more sheltered environment. But all this is basically infrastructure. And there's a point in time when infrastructure can no longer meet demand. Right? The city of Los Angeles is one of these. They've embarked on a very ambitious program to basically go car light, and a lot of cycling now exists in that metropolitan city. This is a highway in China, right? And can you guess how long this jam took to clear itself? Roughly. Is it A, 2 days, is it A, 2 hours, B, 2 days, or C, 2 weeks? Anyone? 2 weeks, absolutely, right? So it took about 11 to 12, how did you know? Were you stuck in that jam? It took about 11 to 12 days, close to 2 weeks, for this jam to actually clear and for traffic to resume, right? And that's ridiculous, that's a lockdown, and as a result, people started abandoning their cars, which obviously doesn't solve the problem because you can't move it, right? And then new economies started coming up, right? New food, new portable toilets, new, human ingenuity and basically being opportunistic. So new urban patterns started emerging from this as well. The point I'm making here isn't so much about what we can do in these times. The point here is that whatever you plan for, there is always going to be a potential crisis situation. So if you put out a problem such as this to a bunch of business students versus a bunch of architecture students and so on, right, you're going to be faced up with many different kinds of solutions. Right? The business students tend to come in from a more sort of economics-based kind of angle. The architecture students, and I take some architecture students at the Singapore University of Technology and Design, they tend to come up with physical solutions. So their solution for an infrastructural problem or an infrastructural issue is to build even more infrastructure to deal with density, right? So you see all these buildings coming up, all these high-density buildings coming up. They're beautiful, beautiful designs, right? But there's always a limit to what you can do with density. And these limits, we've seen examples of favelas, we've seen examples of the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong and so on, and all these were designed as cities for the future, and when the future did come, it ended up being very dystopian because, first of all, you can no longer control the flow of people, right? And second of all, as population starts growing, the infrastructure cannot keep up. So in a master planning exercise, so these are some of the master plan projects I've worked on in my life, they're quite limited as well because you plan for something now, it's 30 years from now before it gets fully implemented, and by then the world has changed beyond recognition. Right? We can't even predict what's going to happen in 3 months from now, right? One more 30 years. Therefore, aspects of master planning now would include simulation and would include analysis and data trending, where we would plan for cities of the future. So these are 3 possible master plans depending on 3 possible outcomes. And these outcomes are fairly simple, right? The first outcome is, what if these points became points of attraction? So points of attraction could be metro stations. They could be areas of high commercial value, right? And the density then evolves accordingly. But if these points start becoming points of repulsion, and these points of repulsion could be, maybe it's a conserved part of town, right, that you can't basically do more development. Maybe it's going to be gazetted as graveyards or something like that, right, where people don't want to, live too close to, right? So these are possible outcomes for possible changes that could actually happen. And then the study of projecting these changes would then be conducted by anthropologists, by other experts as well, and we'd be able to respond to that. So the idea, therefore, of planning and its eventual implementation would continue to be dynamic, and the magic lies in that intersection. So what about on the building sense, right? I started the talk with how buildings can become healthier. So in this case, on the facade of the building, using new technology, on the planes these days. Well, I hope you remember what planes look like and what they feel like, because I don't. Instead of rolling down your window, or the shield for your window, right? So now you press a button and then the glass turns dark, such that during the day, you don't get light in as well. So it's a similar kind of thing where you use piezoelectrics and you use thermal heating. So electrochromic is when you apply a current across and then the glass turns dark. Thermochromic is when it turns dark depending on the amount of heat that comes in, right? So you could do that for buildings as well, and if it's too hot and bright out there, your glass becomes opaque. You would then be able to control, in this case, the performance of the building through your iPad. So if all of you, everyone here is a MacBook user, that's amazing. So all of you started, is it issued by the school? It is. All right, can I sign up for next semester?
Yeah.
So basically, if you had an iPad and you started controlling what your comfort parameters are, right, they will take that average, or the majority average, across a certain comfort zone, and then the temperature and the lighting could then be adjusted accordingly, right? Having said that, of course, there's always going to be a certain population or a certain percentage of the population that are dissatisfied with, the current conditions. And if you don't believe me, just go to any online forum in Singapore. And also basically tracking. So if, again, I was smart enough in coming into the building, right, I would download hopefully an ESSEC app that tells me, look, this is where you need to turn in. Do not follow the GPS because it drops you right at the very front of the road, right? It would tell you how to turn in, which parking lot to go to, which dedicated parking lot, right? Or if I'm cycling or if I'm taking the public transport as well, right? I'll scan in biometrically, and then by virtue of doing that, it records my temperature. Then it tells me exactly where to go. So poor Stella, who's the official who brought me in here, right? Wouldn't have to wait out for me as well. And then, if in the context of a building you have a workstation, right? The lighting of that workstation, or the lighting of that office environment would then obey or basically follow your circadian rhythm, right? And by the time 5 or 6 p.m. comes around, it turns into a warm pink glow, kind of like sunset, and kind of reminds you that it's time to go home, right? Something Singaporeans are not so good at doing, going home on time. And in my case, showing up on time. So basically, this can actually follow. And in the longer term, it actually helps your health as well, right? So we've talked about how the design of the building can influence human health to some extent. I'll get a bit more into that later on. But in the meantime, if we're talking about waste, right? I started off the slide again in being more aware of the waste issue, of the plastic issue, right? What can we actually do to make waste or to turn waste into building material? So the example here is a building that is made out of 1.5 million recycled plastic bottles, right? And plastic exhibits, plastic is now basically vilified and is made the criminal of the material world. However, when it was first designed or when it was first developed as a material, it was a material to solve all problems. It is malleable, it can be translucent, you can turn that into whatever you want, depending on whether it's PET or polypropylene or all sorts. In this case, the recycled PET bottles, they do exhibit the requirements of a facade, right? So the facade in this case needs to bring in light, it needs to filter away some heat and so on, and it does all that, right? And again, you could basically design for intelligent lighting to go behind it and so on. And the best part is lightweight, unlike glass, right? So it's lightweight, and therefore, being a recycled material as well, this whole building is only, I suppose, the structural foundation of this building, the structural grounding of this building is only through water, right? So you're using water to actually hold it down. So a whole vessel that contains water now used to be, or rather is created from used vessels of water, plastic bottles in this case. And how can you take that process home, right? So a mini Trashpresso, for instance, is a machine that's devised by a company called MiniWiz. It's about this big, right? The size of a bench. You throw in plastic waste and out comes usable materials. building links, construction materials, and so on as well. So that's one way of actually, again, upcycling materials in the pursuit of a circular economy. And can that actually come back into buildings, right? So they can. So these different items, right, for building, for usage, for receptacles, and so on, can be created as well. So again, a lot of what I do is in the intersection between architecture and engineering, right? The whole bubble I would draw in the context of this talk, of course, would be business, because now there's no way you can find any grant, there's no way you can find any funding or any support without a solid business plan, right? So I hope to work with you in the future to develop some of these business plans, because the merging, again, of what is technical versus what is innovative from a business sense basically would make the world go round. And finally, in closing, I started out with, what does all the 13 years of architecture actually lead to? Right? It doesn't lead to this building necessarily, but it leads to certain concepts. Again, the 7 EDGs, which would then basically encapsulate what the values are in the time of COVID-19. So why this is happening, of course, there are multiple theories. The prevailing theory, of course, is that we've started eating too many animals that we shouldn't have, right? But the real issue is our encroachment of nature, and nature finds its way of actually, it doesn't really fight back, but it needs to protect its own boundaries as well. So the boundaries of what is natural versus what is man-made is really the threshold of the spread of what they call the zoonotic diseases. And that means we're encroaching into territory that we shouldn't anymore, right? Both literally as well as figuratively. And the fact is, the kind of densities that you see, again, makes it a lot easier for any mode of transmission to occur. So very often you're told, okay, come in, sanitize your hands, make sure you wash your hands every, 1 hour for 30 seconds or what have you. The fact is, a lot of the virus spread is also through aerosols in the air. That is how, I think at least, that is how the cruise ships were such, hotbeds for the spread of this virus, for instance, right? So if there are moisture particles within the air, and if the virus actually resides in that and then it gets transmitted, what can we actually do, right? So we can create cold rooms, right, where the air exchange actually happens, or we can open the windows and allow for fresh air to be pumped in and exchanged. We can allow for air to be filtered and so on. And the fact is, we should not be having this lecture. I suppose no slight or no knocking to ESSEC, of course. It's the way the building is designed. But in such an activity, we could well be doing it in an open area with the windows, or if it's going to be enclosed, the windows are all open. You get a constant fresh air exchange. The temperature out there today is fine, right? So do we actually go back to this sort of environment, the agora or the forum kind of environment, where, again, buildings can be fully naturally ventilated, right? And if need be, can this building become a facility for rapid treatment of patients as well, right? Can we actually create wards and so on out of this? And finally, do we get a certain kind of structural stability such that in an area where is seismically prone to earthquakes, right? Can it actually withstand? So buildings would have to be of a certain height, obviously, to reduce that risk. And ultimately, the building can then be adapted and transformed into different wards for treatment. It can be also for research with a direct access, again, to these wards. And on top, in good times, in the times of a non-pandemic, the roof of the building can then be used for food resilience. So you basically have, again, up here, your urban farms and so on. And finally, in the way it's planned, it has to be accessible, right, to even the most remote parts of the city, right? So these are quick principles that we're basically working on, such that by the time 2050, which is the whole premise of this, by the time that rolls around, right, we'll have buildings and we'll have cities that are then ready. So sustainable buildings that are flexible and promote good indoor air quality. The image here is an example of a hospital design in India. And the principle we set basically is that every ward, every patient is able to see or access greens. So the idea of being connected to nature helps in the healing process. And even though this block, for instance, is for patients at the very end of their lives, they're basically going in for palliative care before they leave the world, right? They're still given that sense of dignity, right? You have spas all here in the front, like a little resort for that mental healing as well, even though the physical healing is no longer possible, right? So sustainability, not just about the environment, but on sustaining human health, and most importantly, human dignity as well. So smartness in this case, as we lead on to the future, 2050, is going to change the world. I suppose the next few decades are going to change the world again in terms of technology adoption, right? But it's never about the technology. It's about the culture, it's about the humanity of it all, and ultimately it's about the planning for a sustainable future. So we talk about COVID-19 being the first wave, second wave, and so on happening, third waves in some countries right now. The real wave, again, is that of climate change and the collapse of the biodiversity, which already is happening, arguably because of human activity. And in case we think, oh, that's not our problem, the fact is we are part of the biodiversity, right? It is not something that is removed from us as occupants of the planet. So, futures of cities can be all these things, but ultimately, it also needs to be healthy, it needs to be human, right? And it needs, basically, for us to coexist once again with the planet. Yeah. With that, that's half an hour, I hope. Right? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. We will open the floor if some of students have any question to start. Ines? Yeah.
Hello. So do you think that real estate developer will be ready to develop such project, knowing that they require many additional costs compared to the normal buildings, and therefore reduce their margin? How do you deal with that?
Right. So that's where you guys come in. That's where the business cases of sustainability will come in. Right. So there's two aspects of looking at it. One is how do businesses perform sustainably? Therefore, you have environmental and social governance, you've got corporate sustainability coming in, you've got declarations every year of carbon and all sorts of things, right? But you don't need me to tell you that these figures can be easily manipulated in order for your report to look good. So let's pause here for a minute. The other aspect is actually the business of sustainability, right? Can you do recycling, or can you do a sustainable business of some sort that ends up becoming, again, a profiteering business of its own? Right? A lot of startups are actually on that realm right now, right? So the intersection between what is responsible corporate sustainability versus sustainability as a business case would lead developers to start thinking that, hey, actually there is value in me actually doing it. For the times when that fails, right, when they are not convinced there's value, we'll fall back again on statutory compliances. So a lot of it is about working together, in this case, with the government agencies, with the BCAs, the green building councils, and so on, to determine what are the minimum provisions and the minimum performance requirements, in this case of a building, that could lead it to be sustainable. Therefore, you've got LEED, you've got Green Mark, you've got all these green ratings coming in, and they have no choice. If you don't perform it that way, your building will not get its license to operate. Right? So it's a combination of all these different mechanisms that would then, I suppose, encourage sustainable architecture eventually. Yeah.
We have a question here. How important, Felix question, how important is a quick rollout of 5G or even 6G to transform cities into smart cities? And which roles do telecommunication providers play in the process? Do you think telcos might become head of the future of cities? For instance, Dutch Telecom, a European largest telco provider, is not only providing the network infrastructures, but also sensors, artificial intelligence, and so on. For instance, smart waste management in cities gains great opportunities as data collectors, and as a result, the dependencies of the respective cities and individual telcos increase significantly. It's quite a long question, but basically this
that is a lecture in itself.
5Gs, 6Gs, and how they will manage cities.
I would say, personally, it's always a question about what sort of control and what sort of power these private entities and these companies would then have over personal data. And I think that is the major concern that, in this case, the US has on China, that China has on the US, and that everyone else who's living in the world who's using a phone would have with regard to their personal life, their personal details, and things you don't necessarily want the government to know about, much less your own parents or your own family, right? Things that you don't want people to know, that's your right to privacy. But if telco companies can operate that way, and I suppose the whole failure of this is because of advertising, right? The whole excuse that they have in mining your personal data is that they can send you products that you want, or they might think that products that they think you want as a result of what you've spoken on the phone, as a result of what you've typed on your WhatsApp message, or again, as a result of your browsing history, right? The truth is we don't necessarily want that, but these are the ways of a revenue generation as well. So I think if we can go back to the fundamentals of the problem and go, hey, look, are there other ways beyond subscription-based models, beyond advertisements, that can then, as a business case, allow these telcos to profiteer the way they were? The other problem is year on year, you always need to see a growth, you always need to see a revenue growth that is based on the previous year, right? So no one can basically hit the reset button and go, look, it's okay if we don't achieve 10% growth this year. 2% is good based on what we're going through, right? But no business executive will tell you that, because it's always going to be better next year, right? And it's always going to be a slippery slope where you go deeper and deeper into this. So I think it's not about whether it's 5G, 6G, or so on. It's about how this data and how this, I suppose, ability to connect is being used or abused. As far as I'm concerned, 4G, 5G, you know, that's a technological aspect. That is a connectivity aspect, right? And that has to do with bit rate. That has to do with coverage and all these things. So it is actually, the technology is blamed when it's not the technology that should be blamed. It is the application of that technology, obviously, right? And that should fall under, I suppose, more stringent business controls, either by governments or by a global authority, I suppose.
Thank you. Question from Alice. Do you think overpopulation, not only in Singapore but in the world at large, will be a challenge for architecture in the future? What are your ideas to deal with it?
Global population, was it?
Yeah, overpopulation.
Overpopulation. I think I started out with the whole density issue, right? And how architecture has always been a response to density, and has always been a response of adaptability to different environments. So it will continue. Overpopulation is not a new problem, right? What is overpopulated now would also have been the case years ago before the infrastructure could actually cope. So overpopulation is only, well, population is considered or regarded as overpopulation only when the resource and the infrastructure can no longer cope, right? And it's not so much an architectural problem per se. It is a problem, again, of national management and to some extent policies. Back in Singapore in the 80s, they used to have a two-child policy, right, as a result. But now they're afraid that the population is not growing, and then that's been taken away and so on, right? So there are different mechanisms of actually controlling that. But architecture, again, with that smart planning and with that, I suppose, future prediction sort of aspects in how you plan for different scenarios. Now that can in some ways respond to the problem, even if not entirely, right? It's a complex geographical issue.
Thank you. There was a question from Matteo. Do you think, which is an important question, do you think COVID and the rise of home working will impact the layout of future building, especially offices and homes? And I just want to jump into what you just mentioned, that's how actually you might reshape all the projects you already have started.
Absolutely, absolutely. In fact, that's something I'm going through right now because of the change in demand of physical real estate, because of possible absenteeisms as a result of working from home situations. Even pre-COVID, there's always roughly a 20% absenteeism at any given point in time, right? You're always going to have 20% of people who are out for an external meeting, who are not showing up at work for some reason. Could we then save that 20% of real estate and turn that into green, turn that into gardens, turn that into farms or something like that within that building, where everyone else comes in on a laptop, sanitized, hopefully, right, on a desk that's sanitized, and hot desk accordingly, right? So that goes in hand with a few things. One is, of course, removing the need for paper, so you don't have your documents and files sitting around, right? Everything is gone digital, but that also changes with human behavior, right? Are you okay sitting in a desk here if you, for example, are the CEO of a company, sitting next to someone who is not, or what kind of privacy realms do you actually need? So all that, again, is thrown up in the air because right now there's a need for social distancing. And it so happens that this pandemic is spread, again, through aerosols in the air, through talking in close proximity, for instance. But what if something else exists that no longer needs that social distancing? What if a new pandemic comes up, touch wood, right? So architecture, therefore, has to be able to adapt and be able to evolve depending on these changing parameters. But fundamentally, a few principles would apply. First of all, we still need our personal space. If I basically come up to you right now, right, you feel threatened, first of all, if I've exceeded my yellow line, right? And you no longer can function effectively because you're protective of your own personal space. So these principles still apply, right? And the principles, again, of overdensity within a certain space, that is dictated by, first of all, in the case of a fire, for instance, how many people can escape this room efficiently, right? So that is still a control. In the case of fresh air, how many people would consume the amount of oxygen that is in this room within a certain amount of time, right? So these principles will still apply. So we're playing around with occupancy versus distancing versus absenteeism in order to be able to design, for example, the new workplace, right? The ideal, of course, is a possible sort of a hybrid situation between a complete work from home environment wherein you would have a virtual stage like this one, a virtual lecture like what you would have conducted, right, versus actual presenteeism, right? And I think today is one of the most efficient ways of doing it that I've seen recently, either as an attendee or as a presenter. I think it's a good combination, again, of physical attendance with virtual attendance.
Thank you. Question, Clément asked you, one of the main issues in the fight against climate change is the energy mix, which is mainly dependent on the fossil fuel. How do you reconcile the contradictions between making cities more sustainable and making cities smarter? It means that required more energy.
It's also sometimes both a local and a global problem. Fossil fuels are used because certain countries, including ours here in Singapore, do not have the opportunity to harvest too much renewable energy, right? We're starting, of course, quite extensively with solar power, which is in the last 20, 30 years has been a very sort of rapidly rising kind of technology. But what if you're in a place, maybe say Central Asia, where you do have a lot of possible wind energy, even more area for solar, right? And potentially also for different countries around the world, hydroelectric power and so on, right? So you first of all look at it locally, what is the balance that you can have between renewable versus non-renewable energy, which a lot of countries are starting to look at, right? But could there be a global energy market where I could buy energy from a place with, I don't know, say you have Venezuela with their amazing waterfalls. Can I purchase the energy that's been obtained from hydroelectric power from Venezuela, right? And then what happens in the transmission of that energy, right? Will it get lost? Will it get intercepted? Will it get, so there's possible different global mechanisms that we can look at in terms of sharing of energy. I believe Singapore is starting to look at that with Australia and so on as well, right? But the issues would then lie in its transmission, of course, its pricing. Ultimately, you only use fossil fuels because right now it costs, 22 cents per kilowatt hour, right? If it's cheaper, you go for it even more. If it's raised, just like oil, like an oil market pricing, if it's raised, then you would use it less and you'll find more creative ways to adapt and to use solar power, for example, of powering your laptop, or all of you would start pedaling on a bicycle that then turns it into energy and so on for charging your phone. Right? So a lot of it, again, is based on market demand. It's based on the powers to be that control the pricing of energy. And that would influence behavior quite a bit.
Thank you. Maybe the last question for today, it's how, because as you know, that's our topic of the week is about Way of Life 2050. How could you design, I don't know that you have a crystal ball, but how could you design or how could you imagine an architect by 2050?
I think, with the profession of architecture, we're always concerned that, are we going to be relevant, say, 50 or 100 years from now, right? Because buildings can almost design themselves these days with parametric technology, with data-driven technology. Ultimately, you could get robots to actually do that, right? But what would actually preserve our need really is the fact that we still design based on culture. We still design based on preservation of what makes us all human that technology cannot replace, right? But in order for us to be able to do that in a sustainable environment or, to create sustainable environments is basically we need to understand business, first of all, because the world, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, it operates based on business cases, it operates based on profits, it operates based, again, on economical gains, right? So without an understanding of that, the boundaries in which we can operate would be far, far limited. And if we continue the way we are as architects, ultimately we'll become artists, right? Who can design a beautiful product, but either cannot ensure that it is marketable, right? So I think it's a combination, not just of architects alone, but it's a combination of, I think, economic policies that are existent at any point in time, green policies that are existent, and to an earlier question, what development professionals also look at.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Szue Hann.